No, Robert snapped, his voice dark. You'll stay right here. James stopped but didn't move. Robert turned his attention back to me, his gaze icy. Care to explain why my wife and my son are sneaking around in the garden during a dinner party? I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, unable to speak, the weight of the moment settling heavily on my shoulders. Robert's voice cut through the silence again, and his suspicion was now undeniable. The next day, Robert's attitude toward me was colder than ever. His clipped tone and icy stares made it clear he wasn't going to let this go. James tried to keep his distance, but his efforts only seemed to make things worse. Jessica, of course, saw an opportunity to insert herself into the chaos. I couldn't help but notice the awkwardness last night, Jessica said, sipping her coffee in the kitchen, her voice dripping with false concern. It was just a misunderstanding, I said, trying to keep my tone light and casual. Jessica tilted her head, her smile overly sweet. Of course, but Laura, you might want to be careful. Perceptions can be dangerous, especially in a situation like this. I felt my stomach drop. Her words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, and it made my blood run cold. Later that evening, Robert called me into the study. His demeanor was calm, but there was an unnerving edge to his stillness. I've been thinking, Robert said as he leaned back in his chair. Maybe it's time we made some changes. Changes? I asked cautiously, my heart sinking. James has been here long enough, Robert said, his tone casual. I think it's time he moved on, found his own place. I was taken aback. Robert, he's still figuring things out. He needs time. He can figure it out somewhere else, Robert interrupted, his voice firm. This isn't up for debate. The tension continued to build as Robert made it clear he was determined to have James leave. The confrontation that had been looming finally reached its breaking point when I told James. His reaction was explosive. He's kicking me out? James said, his voice rising with disbelief. Because of what? A conversation in the garden? He's suspicious, I said, trying to calm him down. James shook his head. He thinks something's going on, doesn't he? That's his problem, not ours, I replied, reaching for his arm to steady him. We knew this was a risk. We can't let this spiral any further. James was furious. He's not doing this because he's suspicious. He's doing it because he's trying to control you, and I won't let him. The night Robert told James to leave was the night everything changed. Robert's voice was cold and firm, his ultimatum clear. You have a week to pack your things, Robert said calmly over dinner. James slammed his fork onto his plate, standing up abruptly. You don't get to decide when I leave, he snapped. This is my house, Robert replied, his voice icy, and I won't tolerate this any longer. James's anger flared. Tolerate what? Me being here, or me getting closer to Laura than you ever could? The room fell into silence. My blood ran cold as Robert's face darkened, and I felt the weight of his glare. He stood slowly, his voice now low and dangerous. Get out of this house before I make you regret it. That night, I found James in his room, packing his suitcase. His anger had not subsided, and neither had mine. You can't let him win, James said, his voice tight with frustration. This isn't about winning, I said softly. This is about surviving. James's eyes burned with intensity. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay with him. I don't have a choice, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. There's always a choice, James said, stepping closer to me. Come with me. The words hung in the air, and for a moment I considered it, the possibility of leaving everything behind, of starting fresh somewhere far away. But the reality of what that would mean quickly crashed down on me. I shook my head. I can't, I said, my voice cracking. James's eyes softened, but he nodded. Then I'll go, he said quietly, but this isn't over. The next morning, James was gone. Robert didn't speak to me, and I spent the day wandering the empty house, haunted by the silence. But the real shock came later that evening when I found a note slipped under my bedroom door. You think you've won, Robert, but you don't know the truth. I'll make sure you do. Jessica. My hands shook as I read the note. Jessica knew. She'd seen something, overheard something, and now she was using it to her advantage. The note felt like a ticking time bomb in my hands, and I stood frozen, the words blurring as I read them over and over. The next day, I confronted Jessica. I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and trembling as I held out the note. "What is this?" I demanded. Jessica didn't flinch. She leaned against the counter, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "Exactly what it says. Robert deserves to know the truth, don't you think?" "There's nothing to tell," I said quickly, though my voice faltered. Jessica raised an eyebrow, her gaze laced with mock sympathy. "Oh, Laura, you don't really believe that, do you? I've seen the way you and James look at each other. I'm not blind." My heart clenched, and I stepped closer, my voice dropping. "If you think you can manipulate me with this, you're wrong. I won't let you destroy my family." Jessica laughed softly, shaking her head. "Destroy your family, Laura? You've already done that. I'm just speeding up the inevitable." Before I could respond, I heard Robert's voice from down the hallway. Jessica's smile widened. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll handle the timing." That evening, Robert was quieter than usual, his mood tense as he picked at his dinner. Jessica had left hours earlier, but her presence still lingered like a dark cloud. The silence between Robert and me was suffocating. Finally, Robert set down his fork and looked at me. "Laura, is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. I froze, panic rising in my chest. I forced a smile. "What do you mean?" Robert leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "You've been acting strange lately, and then there's Jessica dropping hints about things I don't understand. If there's something going on, now's the time to tell me." I struggled to keep my composure. "Robert, there's nothing going on. Jessica is just trying to stir up trouble. You know how she is." Robert studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I hope you're right," he said, his voice heavy with warning, because if I find out otherwise, he didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. The pressure was building. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities. Jessica's threat weighed heavily on me, and Robert's growing suspicion felt like a time bomb. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my heart pounding as I read the message. "Meet me tomorrow, noon, at the park by the bridge. James." I left the house the next day under the pretense of running errands. When I arrived at the park, James was waiting by the bridge, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You shouldn't have contacted me," I said as I approached, my voice trembling. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, frustration in his eyes. "Jessica came to see me." "What?" I breathed, my heart sinking. "She knows," James nodded. "She knows everything, Laura, and she's using it to get to Robert." My stomach churned. "What did she say to you?" "She wants me to confess," he said bitterly. "She wants me to tell Robert the truth. She's playing both of us, Laura." I closed my eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on me. "We're running out of time," I whispered. James took my hand, his touch grounding me. "Then we have to act before she does." A difficult choice and a new beginning. That meeting in the park was a turning point. I knew I couldn't keep living with the fear of Jessica exposing us, nor could I continue hiding the truth from Robert. The next evening, I sat Robert down in the living room, my hands trembling as I prepared to tell him everything. "Robert, I need to be honest with you," I began, my voice shaking. "Something happened between me and James." Robert's face hardened, but he stayed silent, letting me continue. I told him about the stolen moments, the kisses, the feelings I couldn't control. I told him how I had felt alive for the first time in years, but also how I knew it was wrong. Tears streamed down my face as I spoke, and when I finished, the silence was deafening. Robert stood up, his expression a mix of anger and pain. "I knew something was going on," he said, his voice low. "But I didn't want to believe it." "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I need time to think, Laura. But I can't stay here right now." He packed a bag and left that night, saying he'd stay with a friend for a while. I felt a mix of relief and guilt as I watched him go. The truth was out, but at what cost? The next day, I called Jessica and told her the truth was out. She no longer had any power over me. Her smugness faded when she realized her plan to manipulate the situation had failed. "You'll regret this," she warned, but I hung up, done with her games. I also reached out to James, telling him I had confessed to Robert. "What does this mean for us?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I need to figure out who I am without all these secrets." Over the next few months, Robert and I went to therapy, trying to understand if our marriage could be saved. We had honest conversations we hadn't had in years, but in the end, we both realized we had grown too far apart. We decided to part ways, not out of anger, but with a mutual understanding that we both deserved a chance at happiness. James moved to a new city to start fresh, and though we kept in touch, we knew our relationship couldn't continue. It had been born out of secrecy and couldn't survive in the open. I sold the house and moved to a small apartment closer to town, where I started focusing on myself. I joined an art class, inspired by James's sketches, and found joy in creating again. I also reconnected with old friends and began volunteering at a local community center. For the first time in years, I felt free, not from Robert, but from the weight of the secrets I had carried. The affair had broken my marriage, but it also broke me open, forcing me to rebuild my life on my own terms. I learned that love, in all its forms, is complicated, but so is healing, and I was finally ready to start that journey.